dedicate the share to Johnny and Ilan Lieb's father. If you remember, Johnny lost his wife, but he just lost his dad.
Oh, is that his dad? I wasn't sure. Okay, thank you. I must phone him. Thank you. Yes,
a few days ago, so he's had a bit of a month.
Yes.
I spoke to his brother last night, Ilan, and obviously he's also going through a very difficult time. So I don't know Johnny's dad's Hebrew name, but we obviously doing the learning for an aliyah for his neshama. So Kevin, teach us halacha. We've got the three avos I'm looking at, yeah?
Okay. So the next part we're going to discuss is the principles of full liability. When full liability, okay, we did that. Full liability was good. Now, when full liability, when the act is unintentional. Okay, so this is principle D. It says if one, okay, misdirected activity, apologies, let's start here. Misdirected activity, misavek knows that it is Shabbos and that a malacha is forbidden. However, while intending to perform an activity, something else was done instead. Most authorities hold that there is no liability. Okay, there are 4 examples here. Okay, when the intention to do a permitted activity resulted in a malacha, that is, if one intended to pick up flowers which were not attached to the ground, but one inadvertently picked flowers which were attached to the ground, one is not liable. B, when the intention to do malacha has not been fulfilled, but has resulted in a different malacha. For example, if one threw a stone at an animal in order to kill it, but it missed and knocked an apple off a tree, one is not liable. C, when the intention was a malacha with one item, but was enacted with a different item. If one intended to light a specific candle, but one inadvertently lit a different one, one is not liable. Okay, and the 4th example of this, when the intention to pursue a specific sequence of events has not come about. For example, if one intended to light one candle and then to extinguish another, but one unintentionally reversed the order, one is not liable. And a note here is the above principle of misavek does not apply to quantity of activity. For example, if one intended to write a page but only wrote half a page, one is fully liable. So it's basically unintentional actions.
I don't understand 2 examples you've given, because 2 of those examples are for intention of breaking Shabbat. It just so happens you've done them in a different order. So how that can...
No, it says it here. It says it here.
No, okay, so my question is as follows. Yeah. You're not allowed to kill an animal on Shabbat. So here you took a stone and you threw it at an animal with the intention to certainly render it stupid, if not dead. And then you missed and you knocked an apple off the tree. But if your intention was to break Shabbos...
Okay, or maybe it meant like a dangerous animal that was pursuing you. Maybe that's what it probably meant, that. Like a snake or a crocodile or a Komodo dragon. If they're chasing you, you can kill it.
Okay.
I'm sure that's what it meant. Yeah. Not to just kill them, you can't kill, yeah. It should have said it should have said dangerous animal.
And it also said you could, if you reversed the order of lighting and extinguishing, you're not allowed to do that either.
I know, it says so, yeah, I know. It's
okay.
That's very weird, I know. But the animal part must be a dangerous animal, for sure, that you can kill. Because it can harm you.
Okay. It would be nice if they added words that would make sense.
I know, you well picked up there. I agree with you. That's
well, I listen to every word you say, so that's something.
Yeah.
Okay. We don't have long because it seems we've used 7 minutes odd. So I've got like 30, but let's see how we go. All right, just want to bring you up to this point, is that basically we start off and we had this concept of basic precautions. So basic precautions are known as a lesser guarding, and superior guarding is known as taking extreme precautions. So in many cases, a basic precautions suffices, even though it's a lesser guarding. So we've gone through this entire thing about what's the term properly. What does it mean that if you lock up the gate properly? So as you know, the rabbis taught in the Brasi, properly basically means a gate that can withstand a normal wind. And a gate that cannot stand in a normal wind, that's guarding it improperly. In other words, even for the most basic conditions. And then there was an argument where Rav Mani Bar Patas said, which Tana maintains that lesser guarding suffices for muad. As we learned in the Mishnah, if its owner, this was in the 45th daf, if the owner tied the ox with the rein or locked the gate before it properly, but it went out and damaged, whether it was tam or muad, the owner is liable. Those are the words of Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir is basically saying that a superior guarding is required, but as Rav Mani Bar Patas said, if it is tam, the owner is liable. However, if it is muad, he is not liable. Those are the words by Rabbi Yehuda, because it said its owner did not guard it in that case. So what? And then it brings Rav Eliezer, who said that, listen, the only way to guard it is the knife, meaning if it damages anybody, you have to pay. It doesn't matter how superior your guarding is. So you might as well kill it, because otherwise this thing's going to cost bucks. So the only issue is that the Gemara basically deflects Rav Mani Bar Patash's solution, because he said, look, this Gemara could actually agree with Rabbi Meir. Why? Because a lesser guarding Rabbi Meir would say is okay in the case of Shein or Regel. Again, the animal is Kabb. Again, Shein or Regel is muad from the outset. So in those muad cases, it's saying a lesser guarding suffices in certain muad cases, but not for carrying, because the animal is wild and habitually tries to get out of its enclosure. The owner doesn't deserve any leniency because the owner's been warned. It's like receiving 100 traffic violations, and then you want to plead first offender. You've got a habitual nature of ignoring the law. So then the law is not that merciful on you. I think in America they call it the third transgression, where you end up doing lockup time. It's a probationary period, and then if you do it a third time, they really lock you up. That's what Malcolm Gladwell brought in this book. So basically, we said, okay, so we understand in this case that's the case. It makes sense what the Gemara is saying, but that's not the only case in which the Torah reduced the guarding. What are the other cases? For Rav Elazar said, there are 4 cases in which the Torah reduced the level of guarding. They are a pit, a fire, Shein, and Regel. Now, in the case of a pit, it's clear. It's written in the Chumash. What does it say? If a man shall uncover a pit, or a man shall dig a pit and not cover it. What does that imply? That if you're creating a manhole to cover the pit, that is a basic guarding, because that top lid could become loose, it could become wormy, and eventually over time will deteriorate. At that time, it has to be strong enough to withstand the foot traffic of oxen and camels, but it's not a surefire way to protect an individual, an animal from falling in. The only surefire way, if you've got a pit, is to what? Fill it up again. That's a superior guarding. In other words, to permanently reverse the damage that you caused, not to have a temporary cover of a pit. That's a basic precaution. So that's proof that a pit only requires a basic precaution, right? Then there was a case of a fire. How do we know? Because it says in the Chumash, the one who kindled the fire shall surely pay. Well, what does that actually mean? It means that at the end of the day, it teaches that one isn't liable unless you act as though you actually kindled the fire. In other words, you were negligent to that regard. But if you took a basic precaution, you're okay. So what does that mean is that there's a certain unnecessary wording, the one who kindles the blaze. Because it's obvious that if that's the case, you must pay. Those words are consequently available to teach that the damager is liable only if he acted with such negligence that he is legally tantamount to one who set fire directly to the victim's property. Because you must remember that the fire doesn't occur on the victim's property, it occurs on yours. and you make obviously certain precautions to make sure it doesn't extend. So in a normal wind, you've got to say that it is going to, if it is going to catch onto your neighbor's property in a normal wind, that's not even a basic or lesser guarding. But if it's a gale force wind and suddenly this branch flies over with the and burns a zozo hut, well, you couldn't be expected to have a gale force wind, but a normal guarding does suffice. Okay. Now we go into the next example, and then we learned the case of Shane and Regel. If you remember, the case in Regel has one pasuk in the Chumash. It says, and if basically it said, and if the owner sent forth his animal and it consumed in the field of another. So we learned the sourcing like we learned in 3b about what Shane means, what Regel means, etc. But at the end of the day, when it says he sends forth, it means he's actively participating in the animal eating in the field of another. He's like leading it, or quite consciously aware that the animal is eating in the field of another. So sends forth is Regel, but when it uses the term he sends forth, Kevin, it's masculine, which means the owner. If it's referring to the feminine, Rashi said it's referring to the animal, that the animal wanders forth, wanders on its own volition. So both in terms of the reference of the owner by the sex of the word determined being masculine as opposed to feminine, as well as the active word, and he sends forth, it means he's participating or aware of the negligence, and it consumes in the field of another. Also, as far as that's concerned, why are you taking it into another field to graze? So you have to have basic precautions and not sure, but nothing on the same level of superiority, because again, Shane and Regel, it's moored from the outset, but unlike Keren, that's moored from the outset. We know that this animal isn't habitually dangerous. Arthur's just come on. I don't know where he is. He'll be back in a sec. Anyway, listen, the Gemara concludes its proposal because it says it's consistent with Rabbi Meir's view. How do we know this? It draws an inference from the earlier brisa. The reason the owner is liable for the damages of Regel is that he acted like one who sends forth or one who destroys. In other words, he acted negligently. But if he would not have acted in this manner, he would not be liable. That is, if he even took basic precautions, lesser precautions, he would not be liable for this type of damage. That's what the Gemara says. Consequently, although Rabbi Meir requires superior guarding in the case of Keren, he could agree with our Mishnah's ruling that lesser guarding suffices for Regel and Shane. Now, how do we know this? What's an added proof? Arthur's frozen there, Arthur's active there. Okay. What's the added proof? Because according to this Mishnah, it's bringing a source from Rabbah. Rabbah. So Rabbah said a precise reading of our Mishnah also leads to this interpretation. How do we know? Because it teaches its ruling, the Mishnah, in regard to a sheep. We have been continually dealing in previous chapters with the case of an ox. So our Mishnah too should have taught its ruling in regard to an ox. What's different here that the Mishnah mentions a sheep? Is it not because the Torah reduces the level of its guarding? And it is not because here, in the case of a sheep, Keren damage is not written in connection with it, because sheep are not known to create lethal damage with its horns or devastating damage. So the fact that the sheep was mentioned here, no ox, is proof that it's only referring to Shane and Regel. Okay? And therefore, Rabbi Meir would say, for Muad, a lesser guarding is allowed. Why? Because Shane and Regel, pit, fire, and all of these damages, it's Muad from the outset. Only Keren has that capacity where it starts off as Tam and then becomes Muad. So this is proof that it's talking about Shane and Regel, and for Muad, it's a lesser guarding. And the Gemara comments, and if the Mishnah teaches us that Shane and Regel, that they're Muad, indeed learn this lesson from it. So it's saying, you can hold like Rabbi Meir here. Obviously, Rabbi Yehuda would agree in this case. There's no question that if he said for Keren, a lesser guarding is allowed, obviously for Shane and Regal, he would concur. Now, we learned another case. And what case was that? We were saying, look, while we're on the subject, is that we then went to the next line of the Mishnah and says, well, what happens if you have a fold where there's sheep? Remember, fold is an enclosure you create which traps the sheep there so that they eat and defecate and fertilize the ground. And then once they've all fertilized the ground, they then move on, and then you create another enclosure. So it's not exactly Fort Knox. That's how we know it's a lesser guarding, by the way. I mean, you close the door, but it's not exactly a 5-inch steel plating around. So one other thing, it says, while we're on the subjects, we know that it discusses in the Mishnah, if robbers breach a fold, then the robber is not liable if the animal escapes. Okay, certainly we're going to examine those cases. So Rabbi Yeshua says, there are 4 cases of monetary loss for which the perpetrator is not liable to pay under the laws of man, but he is liable to pay under the laws of heaven. What does that mean? In all of these cases, we're talking about grama, which is indirect damage. I don't want to use the word causative damage because I think if you cause it, you pay. So that English word causative damage in the Gemara is confusing. Kev, are you okay? Mm-hmm. So in other words, think of grama as indirect. So anything that is indirect, Hashem holds you liable because he knows your intention, but the courts can't. Okay, so it says these are the 4 examples. One who breaches a wall before his fellow's animal, like the case of a robber, exactly here, and the animal is escaping. Okay, and one who bends his fellow standing grain towards the fire. So we say, look, it's not like he put it in the fire. The fire was coming towards that area, and he just kind of helped the grain along so it would catch easily. But at that point, it's not like he actively pushed it in the fire. So again, it's indirect. 3rd example, and one who hires false witnesses to testify. It's not a case of Adim Zomamim where the witnesses themselves are testifying. Somebody has hired other people to testify, so they haven't committed the sin themselves where the court can prosecute them. But Hashem knows that they've defeated the ends of justice, and therefore they will pay for it. So again, under the laws of heaven, they're liable, but not under an earthly court. And the last one, and one who knows testimony beneficial to his fellow, but does not testify on his behalf. Why? Because the court, well, you haven't stolen anything. You haven't transgressed anything. You've just failed to help your friend when he needed. Sham, kept you nodding. Did you run this morning?
I
know.
I'm tired now. I got up early. I started work early this morning. When I'm fine, carry on. That's cool. I'm with you.
No problem. Well, look, at least you can catch 40 wings. It's not a problem.
No. That's a billionth of a way. This is a brief second. Okay,
no problem. So basically, the court can't prosecute you for not volunteering any information. You haven't broken any laws of the country. But in heaven, if you could have helped your friend in testimony and you didn't, they won't let it go in Shemayim. Okay,
selfish.
So terrible. But those are the 4 cases. So the master said in a brisa, he's asking this first question on the robbers. One who breaches a wall before his fellow's animal, how is this? Under what circumstances is he not liable under the laws of man? If you say that the brisa refers to a sturdy wall, a strong wall, you should be liable under the laws of man as well as to pay for the wall. So what he's basically saying is that the Gemara must be referring to a wall which the perpetrator damaged directly, because how else did he breach it? He must have touched the wall directly. So it can't mean that he's liable for the loss of the animal, because that already it's agreed, it's indirect. But it seems like the Mishnah is making a unilateral statement that the robber's off the hook. Okay, so because of that unilateral statement, it seems that he's even exempt for paying for damage done for the wall that he damaged. which doesn't make sense. That's what the question is. Does that make sense? So how could the Mishnah have a statement saying the robber's not liable for anything if he breached the fold? What it should say is it's not liable for the damage that when the animal escaped because it's not direct, but the wall that he broke, he's liable for. That's what the master is saying here. Why is it that he's not? Because if it's a sturdy wall, it's responsible for the financial loss to the owner. So the Gemara answers, rather, we're referring to a rickety wall which has no value. In other words, the wall had to be dismantled in any event. Because if it fell and injured somebody, then that would create a hurt, which the owner of the wall caused. So accordingly, the person who breached the wall didn't cause any loss to its owner. It had to be dismantled. That's according to Rashi. And he's free from liability even under the laws of heaven. Why? Because if that wall was rickety and was going to hurt somebody, what he did is he stopped injury to a person. But as far as loss of the animal is concerned, the perpetrator is indeed liable under the laws of heaven at this point. Now, I don't agree. I'm not disagreeing with Rashi or whatever. I don't understand one thing, is that if your intention is to rob a place, your intention isn't to stop the wall from falling on somebody if it's a rickety wall and stop them from getting hurt. Your intention is to steal. So therefore, why would you be off the hook and shemaim for property damage? Because it just so happened that a rickety wall allows you a much easier entry than a solid wall. Because, for example, when people come past Sydenham or Glen Hazel, they check, these vagrants check and see if the walls, if you know the gate of the key is locked. I've seen them push, and then they also pull the gate to see if it's actually on a proper motor, or if somebody just closed it and the motor's not working. So the point of entry is always in the weakest position. So them breaching a non-sturdy wall or rickety wall is just the fact that it's easiest to get through. They're not trying to do a public service to save a heartache of the wall landing on somebody. So why should they be free from that liability in Shemaim? But that's Damon's 2 cents worth of a question.
No, I agree with you on that.
Okay. But in Shemaim, at least they'll hold them liable for the animal that escaped. Because 2 things. That animal costs money, so the owner loses, but that animal could hurt another animal or another person in the case of an ox. And in the case of a sheep, if it ran in the road and maybe got hit by a car, the owner could die from the impact. So it's not only liable for the loss to the owner, but the damage the animal causes in having to escape. Okay, the second case. Master said in the Brisa, one who bends his friend standing grain towards a fire is not liable under the laws of man, but he's liable under the laws of heaven. What's the case? Under what circumstances is he liable only under the laws of heaven? Because if you say that after he bent the grain towards the fire, but I mean, the fire wasn't approaching yet, but it reached its way by a normal wind, he should be liable under the laws of man as well. Why? Because if you put somebody's property in a place where a fire will reach it, eventually under normal circumstances, because fires travel, it's as though he set it ablaze directly. That's according to Rashi. And Tosfot actually agrees. He said, well, bringing an object to a fire is the same as bringing the fire to the object, meaning you can't say it's indirect because it's only a matter of time before the fire reaches the a stack of grain. So it's almost a timeline event that is going to happen. My question to you on this is when we learned in Sanhedrin, say you tie somebody to a pier and that tide is low, and eventually the tide comes in and drowns somebody. Are you off the hook for groma? Or since the tide will come up anyway, you're liable under the laws of man. So what it's implying here is because it was a normal wind, you're liable under the laws of man. That's the question, because it's an eventuality. It's not a possibility. So therefore, it's not indirect. So that's my question on what we learned in Sanhedrin. So the Gemara is going to say, well, listen, there's a very, very good reason. And rather, the case must be the fire reached the grain only by way of abnormal wind. Okay, so what does that actually mean? Is that before he bent the grain, the fire couldn't reach it at all. But after he bent it, the fire could reach it only with the aid of an unusually strong wind. That's according to the Meiri. But he's not expected, however, to have anticipated such a wind. That's what Rashi said. Hence, he's exempt from liability under the laws of man. But then why is he liable under the laws of heaven? Because as the Meiri states, he was sufficiently reckless with his fellow's property. Meaning, what was he doing touching his fellow's property anyway and getting involved? So therefore, there is liability for the recklessness. Okay, I'm still trying to understand the fine line there. So there's another explanation why he's liable under the laws of heaven. Rav Ashi said, the Bryce is stated in reference to grain that was concealed. That is, the perpetrator concealed the grain when the fire was approaching it. He's liable under the laws of heaven because he rendered the grain subject to the laws of something concealed that is destroyed by fire. So I just wanted to explain this to you. I don't know if you remember that it was discussed before that if you had a Picasso, I think Rabbi Rankan uses that Picasso example, Arth. If you had Art, you're very still. Either you incredibly still or you're incredibly frozen. I watch all of you. All right. Let's just wait a second for Arthur. Art, can you hear me now?
Yeah, the internet here is shocking. I'm on the internet and it's worse than my Wi-Fi, but in my 4G, but it's the best I got.
Where did I lose you?
Was that 2A or 2B?
Art, I'm having a serious conversation with you. Where did I lose you? Were you
No, you haven't lost me because you're talking. I was listening. I just didn't have picture half the time.
No, that's fine. You didn't need picture. Where did I lose you in terms of concept? No problem. Where did I lose you in terms of concept?
Well, so far at the moment, the concept I understand is if it's indirect. Okay, let's say the guy bends the stack of wheat towards the fire and it catches later. He's not responsible. He's not responsible on the earthly court, but in the heavenly court he is. Okay. If it's just basically
why?
Those are the concepts I was understanding.
No, but why?
Eh?
I mean, you did it with Rabbi Cohen. Why?
I actually did it with because it's grammar. It's secondary. It's not.
No, but what we said afterwards, which is why I lost you. Oh dear.
Intermittent perception there. He's in the hospital.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry, that's terrible down here. And you got to find the right one, and they've only got one here at the moment.
Okay.
Different connections all over the building. I know where to go.
All right.
Not much.
No problem. So what we said, Arth, is that you are liable under the laws of man if it was within a normal wind where it was only a matter of time before it reached the grain that you pushed in the way. If it's an abnormal wind, you couldn't have expected it, but you're responsible in Shemaim because what are you doing meddling with your friend's property? Even if it's an unavoidable accident. Okay. So we're talking about an abnormal wind. And then we're saying, okay, there's another case that if you conceal your friend's stack of grain and it gets burnt, you're not liable under an earthly court, but you're liable under a spiritual court. Why? Because we learned that if you hide a Picasso in a stack of hay and it gets burnt, you don't have to pay, somebody doesn't have to pay you for damage that's done to hidden items. Because everybody could turn around and claim, hey, I've got my Picasso stack in between a pile of hay. Everybody could claim that. So unless it's revealed and people can see it, there's no claim that would be on it in that case. So when he covered his fellow's grain, immediately it became ineligible for payment under that law. Now, there's a question as to, so the earthly court couldn't prosecute because he never actually threw the grain in the fire or damaged the grain, and the fire wasn't at the time. He just made it impossible for his friend to collect. So the question is he liable in heaven? Well, maybe he didn't know of the law. This was what was discussed by some of the Rishonim, is that maybe he thought he was protecting his friend's grain, and by covering it, it would be less likely to be burnt, and therefore he wouldn't be responsible in Shemaim either. So there is a discussion in saying, listen, if he really did that with the right intention, Shemaim knows, and he would be off the hook of Shemaim. But the reality is there are other opinions that say, listen, the thing of it is, he could have just moved the stack of grain away. Like, why cover it? Because what are you going to use? A fire retardant spray? What are you going to do? Put it with sheet metals? I mean, grain's not that heavy. So if you can't move the grain, you don't put something to cover it, which is also flammable. Does that make sense? But in time, they're able to equate it. But this isn't a contradiction, because both opinions about being concealed in a fire, as well as putting it towards the flame that's coming up, are valid. They're both the same points of argument of Groma. And we're going to cover this in the 61st daf. I'm going to come to you now, Kev, because the majority of the Tanaic opinions is if one burns another person's grain in which utensils were hidden, he's obligated to pay only for the grain and not for the utensils. The same applies if the entire stack of grain was concealed and then destroyed by the fire. Okay. What were you going to ask, Kev?
Why is this person tampering with someone else's property in the first place?
Exactly the question of the Gemara. At the end of the day, it's like kind of you're doing life support and you don't know what you're doing and you kill the patient. The patient was going to die anyway. Unless you're a qualified health professional, you shouldn't, yeah?
So you don't say thanks a stack and you don't go with the grain if you're not the owner.
That's it. That's it. So there's one more third case. The master said in a brisa, one who hires false witnesses to testify is not liable under the laws of man, but is liable under the laws of heaven. How is this? Under what circumstances is he not liable under the laws of man? If you say that he hired the witnesses to testify falsely on his behalf, he must repay the ill-gotten money, and he's liable under the laws of man. So they say, like, listen, if you paid the false witnesses in order to get stolen property because it wasn't yours to take and it was paid to you, then at the end of the day, that falls under stolen property. You must return it. You don't get away with it. Okay, so it says it can't be talking about that. What's it talking about? Rather, he hired witnesses to testify on behalf of his fellow. So in other words, what it's saying is he never took the stolen object. Okay, so he can't return what didn't come to him. In other words, his friend Reuven was told in court by false witnesses that he owed Shimon. So it's Shimon's responsibility to pay for the damage these false witnesses occurred, not Shimon's friend that paid these false witnesses, because he never acquired the goods. Does that make sense? And we're talking about a case. So the person that's hiring them directly isn't then responsible under the laws of man because he's one step removed from the process. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's just Rashi saying he hired witnesses to falsely testify that his friend owes money to, like Reuven owes money to Shimon. Okay. So it also says, look, the brisa deals with the fact that Shimon himself can't return Reuven's money. He's traveled abroad. He's unaware that witnesses are false. It's according to Tosfot. Otherwise, the court would extract money from Shimon directly, and the hirer would be exempt under the laws of heaven. So either way, the hirer is not the person that got the ill-gotten gains. That's the circumstances at which it takes forward. Let's just see if we've got a few minutes. We've got 3 minutes, then we're done. Quickly, guys. The last case is examined, and one who knows testimony beneficial to his fellow but does not testify on his behalf. What case are we dealing with? If you say that he could have testified in a group of 2 witnesses, it's obviously that he's liable under the laws of heaven, because the avoidance of giving testimony is a violation of the biblical exhortation. And what is the biblical exhortation? It teaches in Leviticus chapter 5, verse 1, if a person will sin, he accept a demand for an oath, and his witness either he saw or he knew. If he does not testify, he shall bear the iniquity. Okay, so what it's saying is here, why mention it in a Bryce or a Mishnah when we know it from the Chumash? So we're saying that because basically we know that if you're part of 2 witnesses, that if you don't testify, you're defeating the ends of justice. So we're saying we can't talk about that. That's in the Chumash. We're talking about a case here where it refers to a case where he was expected to testify on his own. Okay? Now, what does this actually mean? Well, basically, when there's a single witness and he testifies that someone owes another person money, his testimony doesn't render the defendant liable to pay. Only 2 witnesses do. But it does require that the defendant take an oath to support his position. If the defendant should refuse to take the oath because it has Hashem's name, he must pay. So a single witness who withholds his testimony is liable only under the laws of heaven, because it's not direct, he's not transgressing, because he could have ensured his friend got paid. Because the defendant might have refused to swear falsely, and the defendant might have had to pay his friend for the damages he caused. It's according to Rashi. So by failing to testify, the witness potentially prevents the claimant from recovering his money. Now, you could say in defense, why should I be liable under heaven? I could know that the defendant will choose not to swear, but you don't know that, because your lack of regard for the claimant's money by not doing your part makes you liable in heaven, because that's tantamount to failure to testify. And that makes you liable under heaven, because your friend, you have to do everything in your power to make sure your friend can claim. And therefore you can't sit back just because you're one witness and say, well, it can't force the person to pay. It's got a 50% chance of working. Does that make sense? The reason why you're not liable in either case under man, and it's only liable under heaven, is because it's words. You can't, they're not breaking the law by not testifying. But Hashem knows that you could have saved somebody's life, or you could save somebody money. So you have to testify. All right, guys, we finished. I hope.
Isn't it also like standing idly by when the blood is being shed?
When the blood is being spilled. I
thought you were going to say